It always starts with the stories. The glorious tales of valor, the ragged men who became heroes, the thunder of musket fire echoing through the valleys of Pennsylvania or the pine-covered ridges of Massachusetts. We remember the names, Washington, Adams, Revere, as though they lived in polished portraits rather than sweat and blood. But here's the truth. If you were dropped into the year 1775, somewhere along the edge of colonial rebellion, you probably wouldn't last a week. And no, not because of the redcoats. Not at first. It would begin with something much quieter. Something colder. You wake up in a farmhouse outside Concord. There's no central heating. There's no mattress the way you know it. Just a straw-stuffed sack that smells faintly of mold, mice, and something unwashed. Your back aches. You slept in your clothes, because to undress fully in this cold would be foolish. You share the loft with 6 others, cousins, uncles, the neighbor's boy whose parents died of smallpox. You've barely slept. The air bites. You haven't yet eaten. Day 1, hunger and hygiene. Your first mistake is breakfast. Or rather, assuming there is any. There's no store. No packaged food. What you get is what you grew, or hunted, or bartered. And in early spring, after a brutal New England winter, there isn't much left. Hard biscuits from months ago. Salt pork that smells suspicious. Weak cider not because you prefer it to water, but because most water isn't safe to drink. It's cloudy. It sits in wooden barrels. There's something floating in it. Your stomach turns, but you eat anyway. You'd better. You'll be walking 10 miles today. But you can't yet. Not before chores. Hauling water. Splitting wood. Feeding the animals. Emptying the chamber pot. Yes, that's your job now. And scrubbing it with ashes because you have no soap. You breathe through your mouth. You gag anyway. There is no toothpaste. No toilet paper. No deodorant. No antiseptic. There are lice in your shirt. You don't know it yet. You will. Day 2, marching without boots. The militia calls. You are expected to drill. You do not have boots, not real ones. Just leather shoes, cracked and wet. There are no socks thick enough. The frost bites your toes. Your musket is heavy. You've never fired it. And today, in the field, you learn just how hard it is to even load the thing. You tear the paper cartridge with your teeth, assuming you have teeth strong enough for it. You pour powder. Ram the ball. Prime the pan. Your hands shake. The flint is dull. It misfires. The sergeant screams at you. He's missing 2 fingers and a part of his ear. He survived a skirmish last fall. He tells you you'll die the first time someone fires at you. You believe him, because even drill is exhausting. You march for hours, sun beating down. Your clothes are wool, thick, soaked in sweat. You stink. So does everyone else. The air buzzes with flies. You're not sure if it's you or the man beside you that they're following. Day 3, disease. It starts with a cough. Your bunkmate has it. You hear it through the night. Wet, deep cracking. He shivers beside you. By morning, he has a fever. They think it's typhus. You move your things, what little you have, to the barn. It's not warmer, but at least the air is clean. A woman from the next farm died last week. Childbed fever, they said. Another man, a courier, passed through coughing blood. They buried him at the edge of the woods. No doctor can help. There are no antibiotics. There is no understanding of germs. They bleed people or give them mercury. Most cures do more harm than good. You have a splinter. It's red now. Swollen. You pray it doesn't turn black. Day 4, war finds you. The British patrol came fast. You didn't expect to see them so soon. But they're looking for gunpowder. For rebels. For you. Your cousin runs. He doesn't get far. He's 16. You hear the shot, just one. The rest is silence. You lie in a ditch for 2 hours, covered in leaves and fear. You do not move. You barely breathe. Later, you return to find the barn burned. The chickens are gone. Your cousin's body is not there. You do not ask where it is. Day 5, the rain and the road. You are sent to deliver a message. 20 miles. Through woods. Alone. It rains. Your coat is wool. It soaks through. You are cold in a way you have never known. Your fingers are too stiff to untie the pouch. Your lips are blue. You slip once and twist your ankle. There is no crutch. You walk on it anyway. The mud pulls at your feet. You think you see a bear. Or maybe it was just a shadow. You arrive at the cabin long after nightfall. They let you inside. They offer you dried beans, no salt. You sleep on the floor, next to a dying fire. You cough in your sleep. Day 6, what you remember. You are tired now. Not just your body, your mind. You have not read a book in days. There is no time for reading. No peace. No clean light. Only chores and fear and cold. You wonder why they even started the rebellion. Was it taxes? Tea? You would give anything for a bath. For warm bread. For silence. For home. You cannot write this down. You don't have ink, or parchment, or a working pen. You don't speak of your thoughts. It's considered weak. Unmanly. You carry them like stones in your chest. Day 7, the first real battle. You are not ready. But they say no one ever is. You are handed extra cartridges, 5, maybe 6. Powder is low. There aren't enough bayonets. You're told to aim low, to conserve your shot, to listen for the drum. But when the British come over the hill, dressed in red, precise and steady, your hands shake. Your musket misfires again. The man beside you is hit in the neck. You try to drag him, but he's too heavy. You run. You don't even remember doing it. You just run. And when you stop, hours later you are alone. Alive. But alone. You spend the night beneath a fallen pine, your back pressed against bark that peels like paper. The forest breathes around you, full of things that do not speak English or believe in nations. The frogs croak as though nothing has changed. The owls call like they always have. You press your forehead to your knees and wait for morning. You are cold. Not the kind of cold you knew before. Not the rush of winter wind against your jacket as you walked from house to car. But the deep, bone-slowing cold of being wet, alone, and forgotten. You shiver until your teeth ache. Sleep comes in short bursts, like a flame that keeps going out. You survive the night. You do not feel lucky. Day 8, ashes and dust. You walk back toward what's left of the company. No one stops you. No one asks where you were. Everyone is too busy digging. Shallow graves. The field still smells of black powder and blood. The crows already know. They hop from branch to branch, watching. Your friend, the one who used to sing as you marched, is gone. You ask what happened. No one knows. Or no one says. The sky is overcast. You feel like the light forgot how to shine. Later that day, they assign you to guard duty at a crossroads near a ruined tavern. There's nothing to eat. The last horse was taken by officers. You see a child watching you from a farmhouse window. You wave. She doesn't wave back. Day 9, no one is coming. You begin to understand what it means to be cut off. There is no cavalry, no fresh troops, no supplies from home. Home itself feels like a dream, distant, soft, and fading. The letter in your coat pocket, the one you carry for a week, was never delivered. The man you were meant to give it to is dead. You think about burning it, but you don't. You read it sometimes. It talks about liberty, about a better world. It is written in a neat hand, with words like honor and duty. You wonder if those words will still mean anything when this is over. If it ever is over. Day 10, infection. Your foot is swollen. The twisted ankle never healed. Now the skin is hot, the color wrong. You try not to limp. But every step is like walking on a coal. You make a poultice from crushed leaves someone said worked once. It doesn't. The man who used to know medicine, a former barber surgeon, is dead too. Hit by friendly fire. You sit in the mud and think about toes. How many you need. Whether they'll fall off in the night. Whether that matters anymore. Day 11, the sound of nothing. There is a quiet here that isn't peace. It is the silence of absence, of distance, of men who went one way and didn't come back. You spend the morning gathering firewood, not because you want to, but because it is something to do. Something to fill the time between meals you don't have and letters that never arrive. You don't think about the future. You think about now. About your boots, your coat, your aching ribs, the rash spreading across your arms, the way your hands tremble when you tie knots. You want to cry, but nothing comes. You are past tears. Day 12, a woman passes through. She arrives on a cart pulled by a mule with ribs like fingers. A widow, maybe, selling root vegetables and wool thread. She does not speak much. Her voice is thin. Her hands are red and cracked. She stares at you for a moment, not like you're a soldier or a man, but like you're something dying slowly. A dog at the edge of the yard. A chair missing a leg. You trade a button for a turnip. You eat it raw. You do not remember what taste used to mean. Day 13. Philosophy in the dirt. You sit with a man named Elias. He was a schoolteacher once. He still quotes Latin, sometimes, though no one asks him to. He tells you the war is about the rights of man, the natural liberties endowed by the Creator. You ask him why no one seems free, why everyone is starving, dying, afraid. He says that freedom is a seed. It must be buried before it can grow. You look at the field, the mud, the open graves. You wonder if it was worth planting at all. Day 14. The drummer boy. They bury him at dawn. He was 12. His drum lies beside the mound, the skin torn, the wood splintered. No one speaks. There is no minister. Just a man with a broken voice who says a few words about sacrifice. You cannot hear them over the wind. Later, someone steals the drum. Firewood, they say. You don't argue. You would have done the same. The rain comes again. Not a storm. Just the slow, seeping kind. The kind that works its way into the seams of your coat, your boots, your memory. You don't bother trying to stay dry anymore. Everything is wet. The firewood is wet. The tobacco is wet. Even your thoughts feel soaked and heavy. Your tent, if you can call it that, is canvas roped to 2 sticks. It leans. It always leans. The wind finds its way in regardless. You sleep curled around your powder horn, afraid of water creeping in and ruining what little chance you have to defend yourself. No one talks much. Not because there's nothing to say, but because your throat aches, your teeth are loose, and words don't change hunger. Day 16. The march begins. Orders come at dawn. You are to march south, 70 miles in 8 days. Supplies will be waiting. They won't be. You know that now. Still, you shoulder your pack. It cuts into your back. There's a bruise there the size of your hand. You ignore it. The man behind you sings under his breath. Some old hymn. His voice is cracked like a frozen pond in spring. He dies 2 days later. No one sings after that. Day 17. Feet and fire. You walk all day. Then another. The road is no road, just packed dirt and puddles where cartwheels once sank. Your feet bleed inside your shoes. You try not to limp, but the rhythm of pain starts to take over. Left, right, burn. Left, right, stab. At night there's a fire. A small one. Enough to warm a few hands. No one wastes heat on comfort. You think about shoes. How once in your old life you had more than one pair. You had leather that wasn't rotting. You had socks that matched. You had clean water. Soap. You had time. Now you have fire. And fear. Day 18. The man with the hollow eyes. You pass a village that was never finished. A few wooden frames stand like bones. No roofs. Just skeletons of houses. a broken wheelbarrow, an axe stuck in a stump so long the handle rotted. A man sits on the steps of nothing. He does not look up. He stares at the sky like it owes him something. You offer him food, but he doesn't move. Later, you ask someone who he was. No one, they say. Not anymore. You think about that for a long time. Day 19 rot. You stop beside a creek. The water runs fast, cold, silvery. Someone tries to wash their shirt in it. The dye runs out. The shirt falls apart. You smell something further downstream. You follow the scent, not because you want to, but because curiosity is a habit you haven't killed yet. You find a horse, half buried in mud. Its flank bloated, its eye missing. You stare too long. The smell stays with you for hours, days. You don't eat that night. No one does. Day 20, shoes from the dead. A man falls during the march. Not shot. Not stabbed. He just falls. And doesn't rise. His boots are good. Still whole. Two men fight over them. It's quiet, brutal, quick. The winner limps away wearing one of the boots. The other doesn't fit. You look away. This is not the revolution of paintings. There are no trumpets here. No banners. Just dying men taking what they can carry from other dying men. You remember a time when death was something that happened in stories. Now it's just background noise. Day 21, powder and prayer. The battle never comes. You thought there would be one. Maybe near the ridge, or the river, or some stone church where you'd make a last stand. But the enemy doesn't arrive. Or maybe you were never meant to fight today. Still you prepare. You check your flint. Sharpen your knife. Say a prayer that tastes like dirt in your mouth. You've stopped praying for survival. You pray now that it will be quick. Day 22, letters never sent. You find a scrap of paper in your coat lining. You'd meant to write home. To your mother. Or your sister. Or someone. But what do you say? That you're still breathing? That you haven't bathed in 3 weeks? That the man who shared your tent last night coughed up blood and now lies under a pile of leaves with no name marker? You don't write anything. Just fold the paper again. Put it back. Maybe tomorrow. Day 23, first snow. It's too early, they say. The snow falls anyway. Quiet. Relentless. Like everything else in this war. You hold out your hand and watch the flakes land on your skin. They melt instantly. Your hands are raw. Split open at the knuckles. You've forgotten what warm feels like. The commander says this march will be over soon. That winter camps are being built. That there'll be stew. You don't believe him. But you keep walking. Because stopping feels like giving in. And there's nowhere else to go. You arrive at what they call Valley Forge. The name sounds noble. Like something carved in stone or written in a book. But it is only trees. Mud. Smoke from distant cook fires. The ground is half frozen. The wind does not stop. You are shown where to dig. Not for graves, though those will come. but for the foundation of your shelter. You dig until your hands are numb, then until they bleed, then until someone tells you to stop. You sleep under branches, waiting for logs to arrive. They never do. Day 25. Hunger changes everything. The rations are theoretical. Once it was salted beef. Then it became hardtack. Now it's boiled leather and rats that creep too close to the fire. You boil a bootstrap. Twice. The smell is worse than the taste. You see a man gnawing on an old belt like it was jerky. He doesn't notice you watching. You're not sure he notices anything anymore. You try not to think of food. But you do. You dream of apples, eggs, warm bread with honey. You wake up crying, and your tears freeze before they reach your jaw. Day 26. Feet and fever. The surgeon says trench foot is spreading. They cut off 2 toes from a man you once shared firewood with. He doesn't scream. He just watches the steam rise from the iron blade. Later, you see him sitting on a log, looking at nothing. His socks are red. His eyes are empty. You nod. He does not nod back. Your own feet sting with each step. You don't take your boots off anymore. You're afraid you won't get them back on. Day 27. The General. You see General Washington. Only for a moment. He rides through camp slowly, not speaking. His coat is heavy. His face hollow. He looks taller than any man should be. Not because of pride, but because he carries the weight of everything. No one cheers. You just watch him pass. A figure pulled from a painting that hasn't been painted yet. He looks like he hasn't slept in a month. Neither have you. Day 28. Silence. It snows again. The world goes quiet. A kind of silence that's thick and soft, like a blanket you didn't ask for. The sound of coughing, chopping, and crying disappears under the hush of falling flakes. No birds. No animals. Not even the wind. Just breath. And that too grows shallow. You sit on a stump beside your tent frame, not finished yet. You stopped building it 3 days ago. You're not sure why. No one asked? No one noticed. You think about how long it would take to freeze if you simply stopped moving. The thought is not frightening, only interesting. Day 29. Ghosts. At night you see people who aren't there. Voices that whisper your name. Footsteps that stop just outside the lean-to. You call out. No answer. But you keep calling. The line between sleep and waking has thinned. So has the line between memory and dream. You remember your father's pipe. The smell of your sister's hair after a bath. A clock ticking in the hallway back home. And then nothing. Day 30. The letter returns. You open your coat to find the letter again. The ink is blurred now. Damp. But the words are still there. You read it slowly. Line by line. Freedom, dignity, sacred cause, divine right. You close it halfway through. You don't burn it. Not yet. But you don't read it again either. Day 31. Christmas. Someone says it's Christmas. You believe them because there's nothing else to believe in today. Someone sings far off. A hymn. A verse. Maybe just a broken melody remembered from childhood. No gifts. No feasts. No laughter. Just snow. And somewhere in the woods, the crack of distant gunfire. Or maybe a tree falling. You can't tell the difference anymore. You pull your coat tighter and sit near a fire that isn't yours. No one says anything. No one needs to. Day 32, you begin to fade. You look at your hands and they do not feel like yours. You answer when spoken to, but your voice sounds unfamiliar. You do what you are told. Carry water. Sharpen stakes. Wait. But you are no longer a person. You are part of the camp. Part of the hunger. Part of the slow machinery of this war. Grinding, silent, endless. You hear of victories far away. Of France. Of ships. Of money promised. You do not cheer. You no longer know what victory is. The snow shrinks slowly. Not in joy, but exhaustion, like it, too, has given up. The mud returns. Deep, clinging, cold. You wake to the sound of dripping, slow leaks from the roof of your crude shelter. The logs are black with rot on the undersides. The smoke from the night fire clings to the walls and your throat. Outside, someone coughs until they vomit. They don't stop working. The surgeon says spring is a season of rot. The bodies that froze solid are thawing. They begin to stink. Day 34, what the sun reveals. The brighter days do not bring warmth. Only detail. Where snow once covered sins and wounds and filth, the sun now shows all. Broken muskets, gnawed bones, ruined boots. Torn letters soaked through with old blood. You see things you wish you hadn't. Not for the shock of it, but because they feel normal now. You used to avert your eyes. Now you simply keep walking. Day 35. Training begins again. A Prussian man arrives. He teaches you how to stand, how to march again, how to load and fire with speed, with precision. His accent is strange. His orders are exact. You begin to move in formation again. It feels ridiculous, at first, like pretending to be soldiers after everything you've become. But there is rhythm in it. And rhythm is easier than thinking. You start to feel your body return to itself. Your mind, however, stays somewhere in the snow. Day 36. A letter comes, but not for you. A courier arrives. He carries a satchel full of letters. News from home. Most are undeliverable. Wrong names. Dead men. Disbanded companies. But a few reach their destination. You watch a boy unwrap his mother's handwriting like it's treasure. You envy him. Nothing comes for you. You think of the letter in your coat. The one no one wanted. You still carry it. But it means less each day. Day 37, you try to laugh. Someone tells a joke. A real one. You don't laugh right away. You forgot how. The sound surprises you when it comes out, dry, cracked, short. But it's real. Others join in. For a few seconds, the air feels lighter. Like spring isn't just outside, but inside too. You go to sleep that night with the echo of laughter in your ears. It feels unnatural, but not unwelcome. Day 38, your reflection. The creek has thawed. You kneel to wash your face. For the first time in months, you see yourself. You don't recognize what looks back. Your eyes are sunk deep into your skull. Your hair is wild. Your skin is the color of smoke. There's a scar on your cheek you don't remember getting. You wonder what your mother would say if she saw you now. You hope she never does. Day 39, letters burn. Someone burns their letters. All of them, love notes, promises, prayers. He stands by the fire and feeds them in, one by one. You ask why. He says, because they make it harder to leave this place when it's over. You nod, but you don't burn yours. Not yet. Because part of you still wants to believe there's something worth returning to, even if it won't recognize you anymore. Day 40. The march will begin again. They say you're moving out soon. New orders. A fresh campaign. The war is not over. It was never close to over. The land ahead is unknown. Maps are scarce. Food scarcer. You don't feel fear. You don't feel anything, really. You pack your kit. You rub wax into your musket stock. You watch the last frost pull back into the trees. The road ahead doesn't scare you. What scares you is how ready you are to walk it. The heat is wrong. You're used to cold, wet misery. Here, it's hot and wet. Sticky. Inescapable. The air doesn't move. It just presses against your skin. Your shirt clings like regret. Mosquitoes hum around your ears. They bite through your clothes. You slap them, but they keep coming, like ghosts, like thoughts you can't kill. You miss the snow. You never thought you would. Day 52, the swamp. You march through swamp water that comes up to your knees. You think of snakes. You think of disease. You try not to think of the men who already vanished beneath the water, pulled down by mud or fever or something worse. The sound of boots sucking through muck is all you hear. Someone behind you coughs once, then again, then a third time, and doesn't stop. You don't look back. You just keep walking. Day 53, guerrilla. They don't fight like you were trained for. No formations. No drums. Just shots from trees, traps in the brush, and silence where men once were. You begin to fear the woods more than the battlefield. You reload without thinking. You fire at shadows. You don't know who you hit. Maybe no one. Maybe a farmer's son who aimed poorly and died quietly. You realize this is not war. This is attrition. And you are just one more body being worn down by it. Day 54, desertion. 3 men vanished during the night. No struggle. No noise. Just gone. One left his pack behind. Another took his rifle. You don't blame them. You don't say it out loud. But in the dark, as your hands tremble under your blanket, you think they were right to go. The only thing keeping you here is the weight of the others watching. and your boots. And the fact that you wouldn't survive 2 days alone in this place. Day 55. A town not on any map. You arrive at a settlement. The people stare like you're ghosts. They don't cheer. They don't welcome. A child runs when you meet her eyes. A dog growls but doesn't bark. You trade buttons for bread. You sleep on a church floor again. You dream of nothing. The next morning, the town is gone. Not literally, but no one comes out to see you off. Not a face. Not a wave. Only the wind, pushing dust through the street. Day 56. Letters that never come. You check again. Still nothing. You start to believe that maybe your family is gone. Maybe they moved. Maybe they've forgotten you. Maybe they believe you're already dead. Maybe they're right. You fold the last letter you received, now fraying, smudged, and unreadable, and press it into the heel of your boot. It stays with you, even if the words no longer do. Day 57. Fire in the distance. You see smoke. It curls above the treetops. You smell burning corn, burning houses, maybe burning bodies. The sergeant says it was scorched earth. You wonder whose earth it was. You wonder what was buried beneath it. You wonder if anyone cried when it went up in flames. You don't ask questions anymore. You've learned that answers don't help. Day 58. Friendly fire. You hear gunshots in the night. Shouts. Then silence. In the morning, you find out you were shooting at your own men. Too dark. Too fast. Too confused. They bury 2 boys. Someone carves their names into bark with a knife. You don't stop to read them. You feel sick, but you're not sure why. Is it grief? Or is it just the heat? Day 59. The officer drinks. Your commanding officer stumbles drunk out of his tent. He smells of brandy and piss. He slurs something about glory, about Lafayette, about destiny. No one listens. One man chuckles. Another spits. You look at him and feel nothing. No anger. No pity. Just emptiness. The kind you imagine waits after death. Day 60. You write a letter you'll never send. You find a scrap of paper. You write to your sister. You tell her the birds are different here. You tell her the trees are older and the sun is too close. You tell her you still remember her singing in the hallway. Then you fold it. You tuck it inside your shirt. And you keep walking. They say peace is coming, but they've said that before. And the only thing that came was another month of waiting, of hunger, of standing still in some forgotten clearing while flies circled your wrists, and your musket rusted in your hands, and your thoughts began to curl like spoiled parchment in your skull. You hear men whispering about negotiations, about treaties in France and papers in Philadelphia. But out here in the woods, among the shattered fences and burned barns and graves without names, none of it feels real, none of it matters, because even if the war ends, it won't end inside you. You see a boy sitting by a stream, staring into the water like it might show him a way home, or a face he once loved, or a version of himself that hadn't yet learned what a man's body looks like when it's opened by a ball at close range, hadn't yet knelt in the mud to hold the hand of someone dying too slowly to be merciful. The boy sees you, but he doesn't speak, and you don't either, because language has grown thin and frayed out here. It can't hold the weight of what you've seen, of what you've become. And so you both look away and listen to the water speak the only truth you still trust, that everything flows away, given time. Someone plays a fiddle near the fire, not well, but earnestly, and for a moment the camp is quiet, not in respect, not in reverence, but in exhaustion, and you sit there with your legs pulled up beneath your coat, watching the bow rise and fall like a tired wing, and you try to remember the last time you heard music that didn't come from a mouth groaning in pain, or from cannon in the hills, or from the wind dragging smoke through the pine trees. They tell you that the British are losing interest, that their armies are thinning, that there might be an end to it all. But when you look around, all you see are men who don't know how to be anything else anymore, who wouldn't recognize their own beds if they saw them, who would flinch at laughter, at bread without mold, at silence that wasn't a warning. You wonder what home means to them now, or if it means anything at all, or if maybe the war gave them something clearer than the lives they left behind, a purpose, or at least a reason to keep walking. You find a mirror nailed to the inside of a barn wall, a cracked piece of glass that once hung above someone's wash basin, and when you look into it, you see not your face, but the war itself, gray eyes, uneven beard, sunken cheeks, and something behind the eyes that no longer blinks. You raise a hand to your reflection, not to comfort it, not even to test if it's real, but just to acknowledge it, to say yes, you're still here, and so am I, and I don't know what we are anymore, but we are not the boy who left home with a clean shirt and a borrowed musket. They say peace is coming, but you no longer dream of peace. You dream of neutral things, water, sleep, bread, and sometimes not even that. The dreams have grown quiet, or maybe just tired. You close your eyes and the world doesn't change. You wake and it stays the same. And when the messenger finally arrives, weeks later, dust-choked and hollow-eyed, waving a letter that trembles in the sun, a letter signed and sealed, declaring that the war has officially ended, no one cheers, no one embraces, no one cries. You just watch him, blank and blinking, like he's speaking a language from a continent that sank long ago. Because deep down you know the truth. Some wars don't end. They just stop being spoken of, and you carry them in silence. Like a musket on your back, like blood in your boot, like the weight of a name you don't answer to anymore. You return not with fanfare, not with parades or speeches or even the sound of your own name spoken aloud, but with the slow, careful steps of a man who has forgotten what it means to walk without fear, whose shoulders still twitch at sudden birdsong, whose eyes still scan the treetops for movement that doesn't belong. The road home is too familiar and completely foreign, like a dream you've had so many times it's worn smooth at the edges. The trees are taller than you remember, or maybe you're just smaller now, thinner, faded at the seams, a ghost wandering back into a painting that no longer includes you. Your house is still standing, mostly. The shutters hang crooked. The fence leans. The garden is overgrown with weeds that look too confident in their place. You step onto the porch and feel the boards complain beneath your feet. They don't recognize you. They have no reason to. You knock on the door out of habit, out of fear, out of the strange belief that someone inside might open it and say, "You're home." But there's no answer. There's no one inside. Or if there is, they do not know your face. You step inside anyway. The air is stale. The dust is thick. There's a chair by the hearth and a blanket folded in a way that suggests someone once tried to keep the cold out. You sit slowly. The chair holds you, like the arms of someone polite but distant. You listen. You hear birds again. Not the cries of carrion birds circling above corpses, but regular ones, ordinary and bright, singing as if the world has moved on and doesn't care that you haven't. Someone passes by in the distance, carrying a pail of water. They don't look your way. You wonder if they know what you are, because you are not what you were. You are the sum of orders followed, of friends buried in shallow pits, of boots that rotted off feet, of letters never received, of nights spent counting musket shots in the dark and wondering if yours would be the next to fly. You lie down on the floor, because the bed upstairs feels too clean for someone like you. The boards creak under your back. You close your eyes. And still, you do not sleep. Not truly. Because out there, even though the fighting is over, the silence still sounds like an ambush. The wind still carries the smell of powder if you breathe wrong. And your body, your traitorous, loyal, ruined body, does not understand what peace feels like anymore. You thought you'd survive the war, but no one told you that survival was just another beginning, another kind of march. Longer, quieter, lonelier, and this time, there are no drums. Only the sound of your own footsteps as you move through a life that no longer belongs to you. They tell you it's over. They say the war is won. The new country has begun. The old king pushed back across the ocean like a tide in retreat. And now you're free. They say that word like it's a salve. Like it's something you can wear over your wounds and be healed. But when you step outside in the morning and feel the sun on your face, it feels like any other day. And you realize that freedom doesn't come with trumpets or clear skies or a sense of peace that settles into your bones. It comes like everything else in this life, slow, partial, bruised, and uncertain. You try to rebuild, not just the house, which groans under your hands as you hammer rotted beams and sweep dust from corners that haven't known laughter in years, but yourself, which is harder, because the war took pieces of you didn't even know had names. And now the man who stares back at you in the reflection of a blackened kettle isn't someone you recognize, not entirely, and maybe never will be again. You walk to town sometimes, not because you need anything in particular, but because the silence of the cabin presses in too tightly, and the woods whisper too often, and the creak behind the house sounds too much like marching when the wind runs over it just right. So you walk down the old dirt path where wildflowers grow through the ruts left by wagons long gone, past fields where boys used to throw stones and now only crows remain. And when you get to the tavern you nod to the others who sit in silence, who carry their own invisible baggage slung over shoulders that never quite straighten anymore. Nobody asks what you saw, or what you did, or who you buried, and you don't ask them either, There's a quiet agreement among survivors that the past belongs to the soil now, not to words. And every time someone tries to speak about the blood or the fire or the smell of burnt canvas in the rain, the conversation dies within 3 syllables, replaced by the scraping of a chair or the clink of a bottle or the scratch of a boot against the wooden floor. You try to sleep most nights, and some nights it comes easy, when the wind is low and the air is soft and your mind doesn't betray you. But other nights you wake choking on dreams you can't name, hands gripping a rifle that isn't there, heart pounding to the rhythm of phantom drums. And you sit up in the dark, staring into the black corners of a room that feels too wide, too empty, too full of memory. And you wonder if this is what peace really is. Not silence, not comfort, but the absence of purpose, the long flat plain after the storm where nothing grows because the ground is too exhausted. You try your hand at farming again, but the earth seems harder now, less forgiving, and when your crops come up small or late or twisted at the root, you feel a sharp, quiet guilt that has nothing to do with agriculture and everything to do with what you lost. The years, the youth, the faces, the warmth of your own voice speaking in a way that wasn't measured and tight. You think sometimes about the flag, not the one you carried, not the one that flew above the battlefield, but the idea of it, the promise it made in stitched lines and borrowed colors. And you wonder if it was ever really meant for people like you, people who gave up so much to make it real and came home too changed to live beneath it without flinching. You don't talk about these thoughts. You chop wood, mend fences, feed the dog, nod at neighbors you don't quite remember, sit on the porch with a cup that grows cold in your hand and watch the trees change color like they always have. Because the world doesn't stop turning just because you did. And some days, when the sun hangs just right and the breeze carries nothing but the scent of grass and firewood, you almost believe you made it out. Almost. But deep down, where the war still murmurs beneath your ribs like a second heartbeat, you know the truth. You survived the American Revolution, but it never really ended. Imagine waking up in a cold, damp tent on the edge of the woods where the ground is frozen through, and the wind whistles through the canvas with a relentless howl that steals any chance of sleep. You push yourself up only to find the night's rain has turned everything around you into thick, clinging mud that drags your boots down as if trying to pull not only your feet but your very spirit into the earth's cold grasp. Your body aches with every old wound, every muscle torn and sore from constant marching in heavy gear, from the bitter wetness that never quite lets your skin dry. And as morning breaks, you hear that one of your comrades has fallen ill with dysentery, a merciless, wasting disease that in these conditions is often a death sentence, no doctor or medicine near, only prayers whispered in the dark and the cold. Food is a rare blessing and usually something that barely counts as food, a handful of lumpy cornmeal, a hard crust of bread left over from a supply wagon long past, water that sometimes smells more like swamp than refreshment, and you eat it because you have no choice, not because you want to. Your stomach clenches with hunger, but your mind struggles more with the exhaustion of sleepless nights filled with restless, haunted dreams of the battlefield, of friends fallen, of the distant sound of gunfire echoing in the shadows of your mind when all around is quiet. Even the thought of removing your boots and washing your feet is a luxury you cannot afford. For every moment you spend tending to yourself is a moment lost from watching your back or preparing for the next march or the next fight. The psychological pressure is a cruel master no training can prepare you for. Because soldiers are told to be strong, to be fearless, to keep going. But no one teaches you how to carry the weight of watching your comrades die. How to swallow the terror that lurks beneath your skin when the world is dark and silent and waiting. How to suppress the urge to run away even though your heart screams it's the only way to survive. Inside, a crack grows slowly, unnoticed until it threatens to shatter your resolve completely, making you question your purpose, your courage, your very worth. Fear is not a shame, it's a shield. But when everyone around expects you to be a hero, admitting it can feel like surrender. And then there are the social battles waiting back home, if you survive the war itself. The skepticism and distance from neighbors who don't understand the things you've seen. The fractured families who can't reconcile the person who left with the person who returns. The lack of jobs or futures for men whose bodies and spirits are broken. Society isn't always ready to welcome veterans with open arms. Sometimes it watches them with suspicion or pity, or simply forgets that the horrors they endured did not end with the signing of a treaty. Home can feel more alien than the battlefield because the war changes you in ways that no peace can undo. So if you think you could last a week in the American Revolution, think again. Not about the battles and the glory, but about the exhaustion, the pain, the fear, the endless moments when the world feels cold and unkind, and you are utterly alone in the dark, without music, without light, without hope, only the fierce, desperate will to survive another day. Imagine not dying in battle, not falling to a musket ball or bayonet, but instead standing on the razor's edge between life and death because of an illness that today would be easily treated, but back then was a silent executioner. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, festering wounds without antiseptics, the absence of knowledge about infection and the most basic hygiene. These invisible enemies claimed more lives every day than gunfire or saber blows. Medical tools were crude. Surgical procedures often meant amputations without anesthesia, with survival odds razor thin. Doctors were scarce, and medicines rarer still. You might wake one morning feverish and weak, only to be gone the next day, swallowed by a sickness no one could fight. Soldiers carried moldy bandages that spread infection instead of healing wounds. Frequently, the wounded were sorted into those who could be saved and those who were beyond help, the latter left on the battlefield so the rest of the unit could move on. The injured groaned in filthy, overcrowded field hospitals, cold tents or makeshift huts, filled with disease and despair. These grim realities turned war into a relentless nightmare where your deadliest enemy was often not the enemy's gun, but the invisible diseases that killed quietly. Without glory or stories to be told in history books, beyond the physical horrors of battle and disease, the American Revolution inflicted wounds on the mind that no medicine could cure. Every day, soldiers and civilians alike grappled with a relentless barrage of fear, uncertainty, and loss. The constant presence of death, whether witnessed firsthand on a smoky battlefield or felt in the absence of a neighbor who never returned, etched itself deeply into their souls. For many, The war was less about clear victories and more about enduring an endless series of small, crushing defeats that slowly drained their hope and shattered their sense of normalcy. You might think courage means charging into battle, but often, it was about waking each morning with a trembling heart and choosing to face the day despite the knowledge that any moment could be your last. It was the mental exhaustion of living in a world where trust was scarce and betrayal could come from neighbors or kin, especially in a conflict that often split families and communities along political lines. Loyalists versus patriots, friend against friend, brother against brother. This civil war within a war bred suspicion and bitterness, turning once closed bonds into cold silence or open hostility. Returning home didn't necessarily bring relief. For many veterans, home became a strange, unwelcoming place. Families that once awaited their loved ones with joy now looked upon them with a mixture of fear, confusion, or resentment, unable to understand the man or woman who had been irrevocably changed by war. The familiar streets and fields were the same, but the people who walked them were different, haunted by memories too painful to share. Communities struggled to rebuild trust, to piece together what had been broken, while survivors wrestled with nightmares and ghosts that no peace treaty could banish. In such an environment, survival was more than a measure of days lived. It was about preserving the fragile threads of humanity and sanity amid chaos. The mental battles often raged far longer and harder than the physical ones, with scars hidden deep beneath the surface, shaping the lives of those who endured long after the cannons fell silent. Imagine the nights that followed a brutal battle, when the sky is heavy with silence and the smoke has faded but your mind remains aflame with memories you cannot escape. You lie awake on the hard ground, the cold seeping into your bones, hearing nothing but the echoes of screams, the crackle of musket fire, and the thud of bodies falling. Around you, some comrades sleep, but you cannot. Your thoughts are prisoners to images of friends you watched die, of orders shouted too late, of mistakes that could not be undone. The war has carved itself into your mind like a relentless wound, and there is no balm for it. Back in camp, you might catch glimpses of others who carry the same invisible burdens, faces drawn tight with exhaustion, eyes hollowed by grief and fear, hands trembling not from cold but from some deeper trembling that no one speaks of. There is a language between survivors that is spoken without words, a nod, a glance, a silence filled with shared pain. Yet outwardly, everyone must wear a mask of toughness. Weakness could be deadly, inviting ridicule or worse, suspicion that you are not fit for the hardships ahead. So you swallow the nightmares, bury the guilt, and rise with the dawn to face another day. This invisible war inside the mind often left veterans isolated even among their own people. They returned to homes that had changed, or that they themselves had changed so profoundly they no longer fit. The woman who had been your childhood sweetheart is now a stranger, her eyes reflecting worries you cannot soothe. Friends who survived the battles now avoid you, unwilling or unable to confront the memories you share. The community is eager to rebuild but has little room for the ghosts you carry, the nights of screaming, the faces of the dead. Years later, some soldiers found themselves wandering, unable to settle, haunted by memories that stole their peace and any hope for a normal life. The war was supposed to bring freedom, But for many, it brought only chains of sorrow and loss that never loosened. The scars left by the revolution were not just on flesh but deeply etched into the fabric of the young nation. The men and women who survived often carried invisible wounds that shaped their communities in ways that history books rarely acknowledge. PTSD, though unnamed and misunderstood, was rampant. Veterans struggled with flashbacks, nightmares, and an unshakable anxiety that made everyday life a battlefield in its own right. Many found it impossible to hold steady jobs or maintain relationships. Some became wanderers, drifting from town to town, unable to escape the memories of war. Communities themselves were fragmented. Families torn apart by loyalty, patriots versus loyalists, found it difficult to reconcile. Old neighbors became suspicious enemies. These divisions complicated efforts to build a cohesive nation out of 13 rebellious colonies. The emotional and social tolls slowed recovery and left deep mistrust in its wake. Women, too, bore heavy burdens. Many lost husbands, sons, and fathers. Those left behind had to rebuild shattered households, often in poverty and isolation. Women also managed farms and businesses while men were away or incapacitated. Their resilience was remarkable, but the weight of responsibility added to the collective trauma of the period. Even the promise of liberty was bittersweet. The ideals fought for clashed with the realities of continued slavery, displacement of Native Americans, and economic hardship. The revolution's aftermath was a complicated mix of hope and hardship, progress and pain. In the quiet moments away from speeches and celebrations, the survivors grappled with the true cost of freedom, loss, sacrifice, and a future forever shadowed by the past. The revolution was not just a war of muskets and battles, but a profound human struggle with enduring consequences. While the patriots fought for independence and freedom, millions of colonists remained loyal to the British Crown. These loyalists, sometimes called Tories, faced suspicion, persecution, and violence from neighbors and former friends. Their lives were a daily tightrope walk between survival and exile. To be a loyalist was to live under constant threat. Your property could be seized, your family ostracized, your name slandered, and in many cases, you could be physically attacked or forced to flee. Imagine waking one morning to find your home burned to the ground, your crops destroyed, and your neighbors turned against you because you chose to remain loyal to a king thousands of miles away. Loyalist communities were often forced to flee to British-held territories, like Canada or the Caribbean, where they struggled to rebuild lives from nothing. Many lost everything: land, wealth, social standing, and became refugees in their own country. The social fabric of the colonies was torn apart by these divisions. Families split, friendships broken, entire communities polarized. In some places, violence between patriots and loyalists escalated into brutal local conflicts and guerrilla warfare, making the revolution not only a war against an empire but a civil war of deep and lasting bitterness. After the war, loyalists who stayed faced legal repercussions and social exile. Their presence complicated the new nation's efforts to unify and heal, as suspicion lingered long after the fighting ended. Yet many Loyalists also contributed to the shaping of Canada and other parts of the British Empire, carrying their experiences of displacement and resilience to new lands. Their story reminds us that the American Revolution was not a simple tale of heroes and villains, but a complex human drama filled with painful choices and harsh consequences. Survival meant more than fighting the enemy. It meant enduring loss, betrayal, and the shattering of one's world. For Native American tribes, the American Revolution was not simply a distant conflict between colonists and the British Crown. It was an existential crisis that threatened their very way of life. Unlike European settlers, who fought for control of land and political power, many native communities faced the immediate danger of losing their ancestral territories. Cultural identity and survival itself. Caught between two warring sides, many tribes were forced to make impossible choices, whether to side with the British, who often promised to protect their lands, or with the Patriots, hoping to secure a future in a rapidly changing world. The reality, however, was brutal and unforgiving. Regardless of allegiance, Native Americans suffered devastating losses. British promises were frequently broken, and the Patriots' expansionist ambitions led to relentless encroachment on native lands during and after the war. Raids, forced displacements, and violent skirmishes became daily threats. Entire villages were destroyed, crops burned, and food sources cut off, plunging many communities into famine and despair. Survival for native peoples meant constant vigilance, mobility, and resilience. Many were forced to abandon centuries-old homes, trekking into unknown territories to escape violence. The trauma of watching families torn apart, sacred sites desecrated, and traditional ways of life eroded was profound. The war left native communities fractured and vulnerable to further exploitation in the years to come. Moreover, the psychological toll was immense. Tribes watched as their lands were claimed by settlers, their children taken to foreign schools, and their cultural practices suppressed. The revolution's ideals of liberty and freedom rang hollow to those whose freedom was stripped away under the banner of a new nation. In this context, surviving even a week during the revolution required not only physical endurance but also navigating a complex and perilous political landscape, where alliances shifted and enemies lurked unpredictably. For Native Americans, the war was a relentless fight for survival on every front: military, cultural, and spiritual. The American Revolution promised freedom and equality, yet for many, especially enslaved Africans, it was a bitter irony. Enslaved people were caught in the turmoil of a war fought over liberty, while they remained shackled in bondage. Both the British and the Patriots exploited this contradiction to their advantage. The British, in some cases, offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped their rebel masters and fought for the crown, using emancipation as a tool to weaken the Patriots. Conversely, many enslaved Africans were forcibly conscripted or compelled to serve as laborers, cooks, or camp followers, enduring hardship and danger without any guarantee of freedom or fair treatment. Survival for enslaved people during the Revolution meant navigating a treacherous path between hope and betrayal. Escape was perilous, and promises of freedom were often broken. For those who remained, The war's destruction meant food shortages, increased labor demands, and brutal punishments. Even after the war, many were denied freedom, their hopes crushed under the new nation's unwillingness to confront the institution of slavery. Women, too, faced extraordinary challenges. With men away fighting or lost to the war, women often became the backbone of their households and communities. They managed farms, businesses, and families under extreme pressure, often in dangerous or unstable environments. Some women took active roles in the conflict, spying, delivering messages, nursing the wounded, and even disguising themselves as men to fight. Yet their contributions were rarely recognized or rewarded. The psychological strain on women was immense. They bore the grief of losing loved ones, the fear of raids or violence, and the weight of keeping their families intact amid chaos. For many, survival was a relentless test of resilience, resourcefulness, and sacrifice. Their stories reflect a quiet courage that shaped the nation's future even as history often overlooked them. Take the story of an enslaved man named Caesar, who lived on a Virginia plantation. When the British offered freedom to enslaved people who joined their cause, Caesar seized this slim chance. He fled under cover of darkness, traveling miles through forests and across rivers to join a British regiment. Yet freedom was never guaranteed. Many who escaped faced brutal conditions in British camps, disease, and uncertainty. Some were later evacuated to Nova Scotia or the Caribbean, promised land and liberty that rarely materialized. Caesar's journey epitomizes the dangerous gamble enslaved people took, betting their lives on promises made by warring factions, with freedom hanging by a fragile thread. Women like Mary Ludwig Hayes, better known as Molly Pitcher, embodied a different form of courage. During the Battle of Monmouth, she brought water to thirsty soldiers under fire and even took her husband's place at a cannon when he fell wounded. Her story, while celebrated in folklore, represents countless women who step beyond traditional roles, tending the wounded, managing logistics, and sustaining morale amid relentless hardship. These women endured cold, hunger, and constant fear, often without recognition or reward. Meanwhile, many women managed farms and households alone, maintaining the economic foundation that allowed the revolutionary cause to persist. They preserved food, cared for children and the elderly, and navigated shortages and inflation. The emotional toll of constant worry, loss, and uncertainty was immense, but their perseverance kept communities alive. The end of the American Revolution brought both hope and disillusionment. The ideals of liberty, equality, and freedom were enshrined in the nation's founding documents, but these lofty promises often excluded many who had fought, endured, and sacrificed. For enslaved Africans, the war's conclusion was a complex moment. While some gained freedom through British evacuation or manumission, the institution of slavery largely remained intact, and even expanded in certain regions. The contradiction between the nation's founding ideals and the reality of slavery sowed the seeds for deep, enduring conflicts that would haunt America for centuries. Nonetheless, the revolution ignited a discourse about human rights and freedom that slowly gained momentum. Abolitionist movements began to take shape, especially in northern states, inspired by the rhetoric of the Revolution. The experiences of enslaved people who fought or fled during the war challenged the nation to confront its moral failings, though progress was slow and uneven. For women, the revolution sparked subtle but significant shifts in social expectations and roles. Their indispensable contributions during the war challenged traditional notions of womanhood and laid groundwork for early discussions on women's rights and education. Figures like Abigail Adams famously urged for remembering the ladies as new laws were drafted, highlighting the growing awareness that liberty should extend beyond just men. While full political rights for women were still a distant goal, the seeds of change were planted in these turbulent years. The post-war era also saw the rise of a distinctly American identity forged through shared sacrifice and struggle. Stories of resilience, from battlefields to farms, from refugee camps to taverns, became part of the nation's collective memory. Yet this identity was contested and uneven, shaped by the diverse and often painful experiences of its people. The Revolution's legacy was thus a complicated tapestry of freedom and exclusion, unity and division, hope and hardship. The conclusion of the American Revolution did not bring a neat or immediate resolution to the many conflicts and struggles that had been unleashed during the war. Instead, the years following independence were marked by intense contradictions and uneasy compromises, reflecting the deep fissures within American society that the Revolution had both exposed and intensified. The ideals of liberty and equality championed by the revolutionaries created a powerful new vision for governance and society. But this vision was far from universally applied or accepted. For enslaved Africans, the revolution was both a moment of profound hope and heartbreaking betrayal. Though some gained freedom by escaping with the British or through promises made during the war, the institution of slavery was largely preserved, especially in the southern states where the economy was deeply dependent on enslaved labor. The newly formed United States government faced the impossible task of reconciling the rhetoric of universal liberty with the reality of racial bondage. This contradiction laid bare the fragility of American ideals, as the founding generation often prioritized unity and political expediency over justice for all. The Three-Fifths Compromise, enshrined in the Constitution, codified this uneasy balance, counting enslaved people as part of the population for representation but denying them rights or freedom. Yet, the revolution did ignite new conversations about human rights and equality. Abolitionist movements began gaining traction in northern states, inspired by the rhetoric of the revolution and religious and philosophical currents emphasizing the immorality of slavery. States like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts took steps toward gradual emancipation, though these measures were limited and slow. The stories of formerly enslaved soldiers and refugees who fought bravely during the war challenged prevailing norms and inspired calls for change. However, the path toward abolition was fraught with resistance, and the entrenchment of slavery in the South set the stage for future sectional conflict and ultimately civil war. Women's roles and rights also became a subject of emerging debate in the post-war period. The revolution had disrupted traditional gender roles as women took on new responsibilities, managing farms, businesses, and households in the absence of men, participating in boycotts, and even acting as spies and messengers. While the political rights of women remained severely limited, figures like Abigail Adams and Judith Sargent Murray advocated for greater education and legal recognition. Abigail Adams' famous plea to "remember the ladies" in the new law symbolized the growing awareness that the ideals of the revolution could not be confined solely to men. The concept of Republican motherhood arose, emphasizing women's role in educating virtuous citizens and supporting the Republic, thus expanding their social influence and laying groundwork for later feminist movements. At the same time, the post-war years were a period of intense political experimentation and conflict. The Articles of Confederation revealed the difficulties of creating a strong, unified government from 13 diverse states with competing interests. Debates raged over federal versus state power, economic policies, and the extent to which the new nation should embrace democratic principles versus elitist governance. These tensions culminated in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where compromises on representation, slavery, and the powers of government reflected the profound divisions and challenges inherited from the Revolution. This period also saw the rise of new social identities and national myths. The Revolution was celebrated as a heroic struggle for freedom and democracy, but this narrative often masked the exclusion and suffering of many groups: enslaved people, Native Americans, Loyalists, and women. The stories told about the Revolution became a tool for forging a collective American identity, emphasizing unity and patriotism, even as the realities of division and inequality persisted beneath the surface. Moreover, the Revolution's aftermath set in motion the relentless expansion westward, a process that would bring both opportunity and tragedy. Native American communities faced continued displacement and violence as settlers pushed into their lands, often justified by the rhetoric of manifest destiny that grew from revolutionary ideals of progress and civilization. The conflicts and alliances formed during the war influenced later treaties and wars, shaping the nation's borders and identity in profound ways. In essence, surviving the American Revolution and its aftermath meant navigating a landscape of profound change, uncertainty, and contradiction. The new nation was born not just in battles but in the contested ideas of who counted as a citizen, who deserved rights and freedoms, and what kind of society America would become. The legacy of these struggles continues to reverberate through American history, as the nation grapples with the promises and failings of its revolutionary origins. In the fragile years following independence, the United States faced a monumental task, transforming from a loose confederation of colonies into a functioning republic. While grappling with the unresolved tensions around liberty, equality, and governance, the revolutionary ideals had ignited hopes for a society where freedom was a universal right. Yet the reality was rife with contradictions and compromises that exposed deep fractures. One of the earliest challenges was how to deal with slavery. Despite the lofty declarations of equality, many founding leaders either owned enslaved people themselves or depended economically on the institution. The Constitution, drafted in 1787, reflected these tensions. The infamous Three-Fifths Compromise counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation, giving disproportionate political power to slaveholding states while denying enslaved people any rights. This compromise, along with the Fugitive Slave Clause, which mandated the return of escaped enslaved people, ensured that slavery was constitutionally protected, postponing its resolution but embedding it deeply into the fabric of the nation. These concessions were made to preserve unity among the states, but they planted the seeds of future conflict. The moral contradictions became a persistent source of national tension as abolitionists pushed for emancipation in the North, while the South entrenched its slave economy. The Revolution's promise of liberty was thus painfully partial, sparking fierce debates that would eventually culminate in the Civil War decades later. Political debates over governance also reflected the uneasy balancing act between revolutionary ideals and pragmatic concerns. The Articles of Confederation, America's first governing document, had created a weak central government, fearing tyranny like that of the British Crown. However, this weakness led to inefficiency and disunity, prompting calls for a stronger federal system. The resulting constitution established a more robust national government with checks and balances, but it also limited direct democracy, reflecting mistrust of popular rule among the elite. Voting rights were generally restricted to property-owning white men, excluding women, Native Americans, and African Americans from political participation. The new government faced immediate challenges: how to stabilize the economy devastated by war, how to manage westward expansion, and how to reconcile diverse regional interests. Alexander Hamilton's financial policies aimed to create a strong federal economy but were controversial, seen by some as a betrayal of revolutionary ideals favoring agrarian independence. Meanwhile, Native American nations faced escalating pressure and violence as settlers pushed westward, often with tacit or explicit government support, resulting in broken treaties and displacement. Socially, the Revolution fostered new notions of American identity rooted in republicanism and civic virtue, but these ideals were largely reserved for a privileged few. Women were expected to cultivate the moral character of citizens through education and family life, a role termed Republican motherhood, which expanded their influence in the private sphere but maintained their exclusion from formal political rights. Enslaved Africans and Native Americans were largely excluded from these emerging national narratives of freedom and progress. Culturally, the Revolution inspired a flourishing of American literature, art, and political thought, seeking to define what it meant to be American. However, these cultural expressions often glossed over the struggles of marginalized groups and the contradictions inherent in the nation's founding. In summary, the early policies and debates of the post-revolution United States reveal a nation striving to live up to its ideals while constrained by economic interests, social hierarchies, and deeply ingrained prejudices. The compromises made in this era shaped the trajectory of American history, embedding conflicts that would erupt with devastating consequences in the future. While the new nation's political structures often sidelined many groups, the years following the Revolution saw significant, if uneven, efforts by marginalized communities to resist oppression and claim their place within, or outside, the emerging American order. The rhetoric of liberty and natural rights that animated the revolution provided a powerful language for these struggles, even when the promises remained unfulfilled. For African Americans, the post-war period was a time of both hope and harsh realities. In northern states, gradual emancipation laws were enacted, inspired in part by abolitionist arguments rooted in revolutionary ideals. These laws, however, were slow to free all enslaved people and often came with restrictions that maintained racial hierarchies. Freed African Americans began to form communities, churches, and mutual aid societies, carving out spaces of autonomy and resilience amid widespread discrimination. They petitioned legislatures, participated in debates, and in some cases, fought for voting rights and equal treatment under the law. The emergence of African American newspapers and literary voices also challenged dominant narratives and asserted Black identity and agency. In the South, where slavery remained entrenched, resistance took different forms. Enslaved people continued to resist through everyday acts of defiance, escape attempts, and the preservation of cultural practices. The memory of promises made during the Revolution, such as British offers of freedom, fueled hopes and acts of rebellion. Some joined maroon communities or fled to frontier areas to create independent lives. The tension between the ideals of freedom and the realities of slavery became increasingly stark, fueling the growing abolitionist movement and sowing the seeds of future upheaval. Native American nations faced relentless pressure as the new United States expanded westward. Though many had allied with either the British or the Patriots during the war, the post-war treaties and policies largely disregarded native sovereignty. Forced cessions of land, broken treaties, and military conflicts became common. In response, native leaders organized resistance movements and sought to negotiate from positions of strength. Figures such as Little Turtle of the Miami and Tecumseh of the Shawnee emerged as powerful voices defending their people's lands and cultures. These struggles were not only military but also cultural and diplomatic, as Native Americans navigated a rapidly changing world while striving to maintain their identities. Women, excluded from formal political power, nevertheless found ways to assert influence and challenge their prescribed roles. The ideal of Republican motherhood emphasized women's roles as educators of future citizens, leading to increased advocacy for female education and participation in moral and social reform movements. Some women engaged in political discourse through salons, pamphlets, and petitions. Others became involved in abolitionism, temperance, and later, early suffrage movements. The post-revolution era planted the early seeds for organized women's rights activism, which would gather strength in the decades ahead. Together, these efforts by marginalized groups complicated the dominant narratives of the early republic. They revealed a society in flux, where the ideals of the revolution served as both a promise and a challenge, one that demanded continual negotiation, resistance, and transformation. Surviving, and indeed thriving, in the post-revolutionary United States required resilience, creativity, and courage, especially for those who were excluded from the formal structures of power. Their stories remind us that the American Revolution was not a singular event, but a beginning, a catalyst for ongoing struggles over freedom, equality, and justice that continue to this day. Among African Americans, one of the most influential figures was Phillis Wheatley, an enslaved woman who became the first published African American poet. Her work, imbued with classical themes, Christian spirituality, and reflections on freedom, challenged prevailing notions of African intellectual inferiority. Wheatley's poetry gained international acclaim and helped to sow early seeds of abolitionist sentiment by illustrating the humanity and talents of African people, directly confronting racist assumptions embedded in American society, though she remained enslaved during her lifetime. Her literary legacy symbolized a powerful assertion of Black identity and dignity in the face of oppression. Alongside cultural contributions like Wheatley's, African Americans also participated in organized abolitionist efforts. Groups such as the Free African Society, founded in Philadelphia in 1787 by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, provided mutual aid and spiritual leadership for free Black communities. These organizations became centers of activism and empowerment, laying the groundwork for the burgeoning abolitionist movement that would gain momentum throughout the 19th century. Petition campaigns and public debates increasingly highlighted the contradictions between American ideals and the persistence of slavery, gradually forcing the nation to confront its moral crisis. In the South and on the frontier, enslaved and free African Americans continued to resist through both overt and covert means. The fear of revolts like the Stono Rebellion and later insurrections compelled slaveholders to enact increasingly brutal controls, yet resistance persisted. This tension between control and resistance shaped the social dynamics of the South for decades, underscoring the deeply rooted conflicts that the Revolution had only partially unsettled. Native American leaders also emerged as pivotal figures in resisting U.S. expansion and asserting sovereignty. Little Turtle, a war chief of the Miami tribe, led Native confederations to several victories against U.S. forces in the 1790s, temporarily halting American westward advance in the Northwest Territory. His leadership demonstrated Native resilience and military acumen, complicating the narrative of inevitable American dominance. Similarly, Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader, forged a pan-tribal alliance aimed at resisting settler encroachment and preserving Native lands and culture. His vision for Native unity and resistance extended beyond military engagement to political and cultural revival, inspiring Native activism for generations. Women's activism in this era, though often constrained by social norms, was equally impactful. Abigail Adams remains one of the most famous early advocates for women's rights, famously urging her husband John Adams to remember the ladies when framing new laws. Though women did not gain voting rights, the notion of Republican motherhood promoted education for women as crucial for raising informed citizens, expanding their role within the domestic and social spheres. Women also became involved in early abolitionist campaigns, with figures like Phillis Wheatley and later Sojourner Truth weaving the causes of racial and gender equality together. The post-revolutionary era also saw the beginnings of organized women's rights movements. Women formed societies focused on temperance, education reform, and abolition, where they developed leadership skills and public voices. These organizations laid important foundations for the suffrage movement that would emerge in the mid-19th century, connecting the fight for women's political rights to broader struggles for justice. Together, the activism and leadership of marginalized groups during the early republic reveal a dynamic and contested process of nation building. These communities used the language and ideals of the revolution to challenge exclusion, assert their rights, and shape America's evolving identity. Their struggles underscore that the promise of the revolution was neither automatic nor complete, but required continual effort, courage, and vision. As the new United States government took shape under the Constitution, fierce debates erupted over the balance between federal power and individual liberties, reflecting the revolution's complex legacy. The absence of an explicit list of rights in the original Constitution alarmed many citizens, who feared that the new federal government might become as oppressive as the British Crown they had fought against. This concern led to the adoption of the Bill of Rights in 1791, a set of 10 amendments aimed at protecting freedoms such as speech, religion, and due process. However, these protections primarily applied to white men, leaving many groups outside the formal guarantees of liberty. Citizenship and suffrage were particularly contentious issues. While the revolution had popularized ideas of political participation, voting rights remained restricted. Most states limited suffrage to white male property owners, excluding women, Native Americans, and the vast majority of African Americans. This exclusion reflected prevailing beliefs about who was capable of responsible citizenship and who deserved political power. Nevertheless, the language of the revolution inspired ongoing challenges to these limitations. African Americans in northern states sometimes won the right to vote, though these gains were precarious and often rolled back in later years. Native Americans were generally denied citizenship altogether, treated as sovereign nations or foreign peoples rather than members of the Republic. The question of who counted as a citizen also played out in debates over the Naturalization Act of 1790, which limited citizenship to free white persons, explicitly excluding non-white populations. This law institutionalized racial exclusion in the young nation's legal framework and underscored how racial hierarchies were deeply woven into American identity from the outset. These racialized citizenship rules would have lasting consequences, influencing immigration policies and civil rights struggles centuries later. Women's exclusion from political rights remained virtually absolute, though their influence in social and cultural spheres grew. The ideal of Republican motherhood expanded women's roles in shaping the nation's future by emphasizing their responsibility to raise virtuous citizens. Education for girls became more widespread, and women's involvement in reform movements planted seeds for the later suffrage movement. Yet formal political equality remained distant, and legal doctrines such as coverture meant that women's legal identities were subsumed under their husbands. These early legal and political battles highlight the revolution's unfinished project, creating a republic based on liberty and equality, yet grappling with entrenched inequalities. The foundational laws codified compromises that preserved slavery, racial exclusion, and gender inequality, even as activists within and outside these communities pushed to expand the meaning of freedom. The tension between revolutionary ideals and social realities would continue to shape American politics, inspiring both reform and resistance. The debates over rights and citizenship set precedents for future struggles, whether in abolitionism, women's suffrage, civil rights, or immigration, making clear that the revolution's promise was a work in progress, constantly negotiated and contested. The decades following the American Revolution were marked by vibrant political activism and reform movements, as various groups sought to translate the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality into concrete social and political changes. The young republic's contradictions between freedom and exclusion, democracy and hierarchy, fueled spirited debates and struggles that laid the groundwork for America's evolving democratic identity. One of the most significant early reform movements was abolitionism, which gained momentum in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Inspired by revolutionary rhetoric and Enlightenment ideals, abolitionists argued that slavery was incompatible with the principles of liberty enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. Early abolitionists included both white activists and African Americans, who used moral persuasion, petitions, and political lobbying to challenge the institution of slavery. The establishment of abolitionist societies, such as the Pennsylvania Abolition Society founded in 1775, marked the beginning of organized efforts to end slavery. African American abolitionists played a critical role in this movement. Figures like Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery and became a powerful orator and writer, challenged the nation to confront its hypocrisy. Earlier activists, such as David Walker, published incendiary calls for immediate emancipation and equal rights, warning that justice delayed risked violent upheaval. These voices demonstrated how enslaved and free black people were not passive victims but active agents shaping the nation's moral and political landscape. Women were deeply involved in abolitionism, and this activism intersected with the burgeoning women's rights movement. Women abolitionists organized fundraising, wrote essays, and participated in lectures, often facing criticism for stepping outside traditional gender roles. Their activism helped spark broader debates about women's place in public life, leading to early calls for suffrage and legal reforms. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which would emerge from these interconnected struggles, is often seen as the formal beginning of the American women's rights movement. Meanwhile, Native American resistance and advocacy continued in response to relentless land dispossession and cultural pressures. Although often marginalized from national politics, Native leaders and communities employed a range of strategies, from armed resistance to diplomatic negotiations, to protect their sovereignty. Their persistent challenges to American expansionism exposed the limits of the Revolution's promise of self-determination, as indigenous peoples remained largely excluded from the benefits of independence. In the political arena, the era saw the emergence of the first political parties, which reflected and intensified debates over the nature of the Republic. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, favored a strong central government and closer ties to Britain, while the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, advocated for states' rights and an agrarian vision of America. These divisions often intersected with regional, economic, and social tensions, including differing views on slavery, Native American policy, and the extension of suffrage. At the same time, the franchise gradually expanded in many states, as property requirements for voting were lowered or eliminated for white men. This shift represented a significant, if incomplete, democratization of political life, expanding participation but continuing to exclude women, Native Americans, and most African Americans. The debates over who should be allowed to vote, hold office, and enjoy full citizenship remained central to American political life. Culturally, the post-revolutionary period was a time of defining American identity through literature, art, and public rituals. National holidays, monuments, and histories were created to celebrate the revolution and its heroes, helping to forge a sense of shared purpose and patriotism. Yet these narratives often glossed over the ongoing struggles of marginalized groups, reflecting the persistent tensions between ideals and realities. In sum, the early republic was a crucible of contestation and transformation. The revolution's ideals provided inspiration and language for reformers across race, gender, and class lines, even as entrenched inequalities and exclusions shaped the limits of change. The activism and political conflicts of this era set the stage for the profound upheavals of the 19th century, as America continued to grapple with its founding promises and contradictions. The abolitionist movement in the early United States was deeply intertwined with the ideals of the American Revolution. The rhetoric of liberty, equality, and natural rights inspired many to question the morality of slavery, which stood as a glaring contradiction to the promises made in 1776. Yet abolition was not a universally accepted cause. It was fiercely opposed by entrenched economic interests, particularly in the South, and met with violent resistance. Despite these challenges, abolitionists persisted, often at great personal risk. In northern states, gradual emancipation laws reflected growing anti-slavery sentiment, although these laws frequently included provisions that prolonged bondage or limited the rights of freed African Americans. Abolitionists organized societies such as the American Anti-Slavery Society, founded in 1833, and published newspapers, pamphlets, and books that exposed the brutal realities of slavery. The movement was notable for its interracial cooperation, with free African Americans playing leadership roles alongside white allies. Abolitionist speakers toured the country, giving emotional and compelling accounts of slavery's injustices, sparking both sympathy and fierce backlash. Women played a crucial role in abolitionism, often using their positions in churches, schools, and social organizations to mobilize support. Female abolitionists like Lucretia Mott and Angelina Grimke also began to question their own exclusion from political rights, linking the fight against slavery with the fight for women's equality. These connections led to the organization of the first women's rights conventions, including the landmark Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. There, activists drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which explicitly modeled itself on the Declaration of Independence and demanded equal rights for women, including the right to vote. The women's suffrage movement initially grew out of abolitionist activism, as women who had campaigned against slavery realized they also needed to challenge the patriarchal limits of American democracy. women's rights advocates faced widespread opposition and skepticism, even from some abolitionists, but their efforts planted the seeds for the eventual expansion of voting rights and legal equality. Meanwhile, Native American communities continued to resist displacement and cultural erasure through both armed resistance and legal challenges. Despite relentless pressure from settlers and government policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which led to the tragic Trail of Tears, Native leaders worked tirelessly to preserve their nation's sovereignty and heritage. Their resistance highlighted the revolution's incomplete promises and the enduring struggle of indigenous peoples in the American story. Culturally, abolitionist and women's rights activism inspired a flourishing of literature, art, and speeches that sought to reshape American identity. Writers like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth combined personal narrative with political argument to powerful effect, while women's rights advocates used newspapers and public forums to articulate visions of equality and justice. These cultural expressions not only mobilized supporters but also challenged dominant narratives that marginalized or silenced these voices. In this way, the early reform movements reflected a dynamic interplay between revolutionary ideals and social realities. They demonstrated how the revolution's legacy was not fixed but continually reinterpreted and contested by those who sought a more inclusive and equitable society. The struggles of abolitionists, women's rights advocates, and Native American leaders laid the groundwork for ongoing efforts to expand freedom and democracy in America. One of the most powerful moments in the abolitionist movement came with Frederick Douglass's eloquent speeches and writings. After escaping slavery in 1838, Douglass quickly became a leading voice for abolition, using his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, 1845, to expose the brutal realities of slavery with unflinching honesty. His oratory skills electrified audiences across the North, making the abstract principles of liberty visceral and urgent. Douglass challenged both the institution of slavery and the racial prejudices embedded in American society, demanding full citizenship and rights for African Americans. His presence on the lecture circuit was a vital catalyst for the growing abolitionist cause. At the same time, women abolitionists such as Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton began to confront their own exclusion from the political sphere. Their experience at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, where women delegates were denied full participation, galvanized their determination to fight for women's rights. This frustration led directly to the organization of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the first women's rights convention in the United States. There, Stanton and Mott presented the Declaration of Sentiments, a bold document that demanded equality for women in every aspect of life, including the right to vote. Modeled on the Declaration of Independence, it declared that all men and women are created equal, a revolutionary claim that challenged deeply ingrained gender norms. The Seneca Falls Convention marked the beginning of an organized women's rights movement, but progress was slow and often met with hostility. Many Americans found the idea of women voting and holding political office radical or threatening. Nevertheless, the convention inspired a series of petitions, lectures, and organizing efforts that slowly broadened support. Women like Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth emerged as national leaders who tirelessly campaigned for suffrage, abolition, and broader social reforms. In the legal arena, abolitionists fought critical battles as well. The infamous Dred Scott versus Sandford case of 1857 starkly revealed the limits of African American rights under U.S. law. The Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. This decision inflamed sectional tensions and galvanized abolitionist efforts, underscoring the urgent need for constitutional change. Similarly, Native American communities continued their legal and diplomatic resistance despite mounting pressure. Although often pushed to the margins, Native leaders sought to assert their sovereignty through treaties and appeals to the federal government. However, policies such as the Indian Removal Act authorized forced relocations, resulting in suffering and death, most notoriously during the Trail of Tears, when thousands of Cherokee and other tribes were uprooted from their ancestral lands. These tragedies exposed the darker side of American expansionism and the unfulfilled promises of liberty for indigenous peoples. Culturally, abolitionism and women's rights activism inspired a rich body of speeches, literature, and art. Sojourner Truth's famous "Ain't I a Woman?" speech, delivered in 1851 at a women's rights convention, combined arguments about race and gender to challenge both white feminists and racist assumptions. Her words captured the intersectional nature of oppression and resilience, forcing audiences to reconsider the meaning of equality. These landmark events, speeches, and legal battles illustrate how the ideals born in the Revolution continued to spark activism and provoke conflict throughout the early 19th century. The nation's evolving identity was shaped by these struggles over who could claim the rights and freedoms promised by independence. The abolitionist and women's rights movements laid crucial foundations for the transformations that would come with the Civil War and beyond. As the 19th century progressed, the abolitionist and women's rights movements increasingly shaped the political discourse of the United States, heightening sectional tensions and challenging the existing social order. The unresolved contradictions of the American Revolution, the promise of liberty paired with the reality of slavery and exclusion, became impossible to ignore as debates over these issues polarized the nation. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories acquired after the Louisiana Purchase and following the Mexican-American War ignited fierce political battles. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 sought temporary peace by balancing free and slave states, but ultimately only postponed conflict. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, part of the latter compromise, outraged abolitionists because it required citizens in free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people, violating northern states' laws and moral codes. This law intensified activism, with many joining the Underground Railroad to help enslaved people flee to freedom. Political parties fractured over these issues. The Whig Party disintegrated, while the Democratic Party split along sectional lines. New parties such as the Free Soil Party and later the Republican Party emerged with platforms opposing the extension of slavery. The Republican Party, founded in the 1850s, explicitly aimed to halt slavery's spread, attracting abolitionists and former Whigs. Its rapid rise alarmed the South, contributing to the secession crisis. Women's rights advocates were deeply engaged in these political upheavals. Many aligned with abolitionists, believing that the fight for African American freedom was inseparable from their own quest for gender equality. However, the movement sometimes faced internal divisions. Some women's rights leaders prioritized abolition, while others insisted on focusing solely on women's issues. Despite this, women's increasing political activism helped lay the groundwork for future suffrage victories. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852 played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. The novel's vivid portrayal of slavery's cruelty galvanized many in the North to support abolition and heightened sectional animosities. It became a cultural touchstone, illustrating how literature could influence political movements and popular sentiment. By the mid-1850s, violent confrontations such as Bleeding Kansas exposed the explosive nature of the slavery debate. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed violently over the territory's status, signaling that legislative compromises were failing. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision further inflamed tensions by denying African Americans citizenship and declaring the federal government powerless to regulate slavery in the territories. These mounting conflicts set the stage for the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, whose Republican platform opposed slavery's expansion. His victory triggered the secession of Southern states and the onset of the Civil War, a brutal conflict that would ultimately decide the fate of slavery and test the nation's commitment to its founding ideals. Throughout this turbulent period, the legacies of abolitionist and women's rights activism reverberated. African American soldiers fought for the Union, women served as nurses and spies, and activists continued to push for full citizenship rights. The war and its aftermath would bring about monumental changes, including the Emancipation Proclamation and, eventually, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery and expanded citizenship and voting rights, though not yet fully for women. The decades of reform, activism, and political struggle following the Revolution illustrate how the nation grappled with its promises and contradictions. The battles over slavery and suffrage were central to defining American democracy, shaping the course of history in profound ways.